Welcome to Module 3 in 289M, and in Module 3 we're going to talk about user and service account configuration. So we've got several objectives here: configure user accounts and group policies, account policies, password settings, and work with service accounts. We touched a little bit on those in a previous module. So user accounts have two functions: provide a method for user authentication and provide detailed information about the user. And this is a slide that's a duplicate from the previous module, but it sets up what we're going to be talking about here. So we've got group policies. Group policies, a list of setting administrators use to configure user and computer operating environments remotely. So I've used group policies in a lot of different ways. I've used it to hide things from users so they can't do things they're not supposed to be doing. I've done it so it automatically launches programs, it runs scripts, lots of different things to do. And it's very useful. It also allows you to add security as well. So you can change the password complexity, how often the passwords need to be changed, and that kind of thing. So as we discussed last time, when Active Directory is installed, two group policy objects or GPOs are created: the default domain policy, which affects everybody in the domain, every user, every computer, and the default domain controllers policy, which just affects the domain controllers themselves. And that's in order to protect you from accidentally locking yourself out of your domain controller. So we create and manage GPOs by using the Group Policy Management Console. We'll be doing that in this lab. Each GPO has two main modes. You've got computer configuration and user configuration. So this is really important. So when you go in and make a change to user configuration, it's only going to affect the user on any computer. If you go in and make changes to the computer configuration, it's going to affect all the computers, no matter who logs into it. Now, if you do both, you want to make sure that they don't conflict with each other, because group policy is going to automatically pick a winner for you, and it may not be the result that you want. You can also initiate group policy updates just by typing the GP update at a command. And typically, you may also do the /force switch as well to make sure that it gets applied. So if you don't want to have to reboot your computer or wait until the next time you log in, then you can do that GP update command. Account policy control settings related to user authentication and logon. They are found in a group policy object in a certain path. So whenever you see a path for group policy, you want to pay attention to it, because it's almost impossible to find a specific group policy object to make a change to. And that's because there are hundreds of different options. So in this case, the path shows computer configuration. Then you click on the subfolder policies, subfolders, Windows settings, etc., etc. So these account policies are effective only if the group policy object where they're configured is linked to the domain. So it has to be part of the domain to make that work. There are three subnodes under account policies. You've got the password policy, the account lockout policy, and the Kerberos policy. So those all affect the users when they log in. So for instance, password policy, it says how complex a password is. Account lockout policy says if you type the password incorrect so many times, then the account is going to be locked, and it has to be unlocked by the administrator. Kerberos policy uses policies to fine-tune parameters for Kerberos and deal mostly with the length of time Kerberos authentication tickets are active. So when you log into a computer, you're given what's called a Kerberos ticket. And this ticket is only good for so long. So you want to make sure that from the time you create the ticket and log in, that it doesn't exceed these parameters. Otherwise, you'll have problems accessing devices and folders, things like that. So there's this policy that by default is a pretty good policy, but if you need to fine-tune it, the policy is there to change. So here are the three different policies we just discussed. Under account policies, you can see password, lockout, and Kerberos. So under password, you can see the list on the right-hand side of all the different things you can change. And you probably remember from 240M, these are some of the things that we did change in group policy. So delegating password settings, you have lots of different objects. You can delegate the following tasks to junior administrators. So if you don't want to give a junior administrator full access to Active Directory, you can create certain rights that the junior administrator can do, such as resetting user passwords, force password change, etc., read all user information, create and delete, manage groups. So you can give them just the rights that they need, which is really helpful. And we've got the password policies on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side it says who has the ability to make any of these changes. Local account policies. These are policies set in the group policy objects linked to OUs, and these take precedence over policies set at the domain level. So unless the GPO is linked to the domain, it has the enforced setting enabled. So you can go in and at the group policy object, you can go in and say, this is going to be enforced. You have to have this apply. But if you don't have that, then these local account policies will take precedence over the domain level policies. And the local ones, of course, are at the computer level. So policies that aren't defined at all by a group policy object linked to an OU use the policy setting defined in the domain linked GPO. So if you have a group policy object that isn't defined, it will look for another policy above it that will have it set, in this case at the domain level. Kerberos, we talked a little bit about Kerberos. It's the authentication protocol used in a Windows domain environment. So this is when you go to log into a computer, it takes you to the domain. Kerberos is the one that authenticates you and grants you the access or denies you the access if you don't put in the right credentials. It provides mutual authentication between the client and server. So it's not just one way, it's two-way. And it uses a shared key encryption to ensure privacy and passwords are never sent across the network. Password setting object enables administrator to configure password settings for users and groups that are different from those defined in a GPO. So you can also refer to this as a fine-grained password policy. These PSOs have the effect of overriding account policies at the domain level. So if you've made changes to account policies at the domain level, these password setting objects will override it. So creating a PSO, they're created with administrative access when you log into the Active Directory Administrative Center, ADSI, edit, or PowerShell commandlets. Using ADAC is the most convenient method, and you can specify any setting under the password policy and account lockout policy nodes, but not the Kerberos policy node. So this is different from the Kerberos one. So if you have more than one of these PSOs applied to a user, the PSO with the highest precedence value is applied. So you've got some basic steps for creating a PSO. You open Active Directory Administrative Center, expand the domain node, double-click the system, and then the password setting container. And then you go to the password settings. Service accounts. This is a user account that Windows Services uses to log on to a computer. So sometimes when you go to install a program, it also creates a service with it. And when it does that, it has to use some sort of a username and a password to log on to make that service work. So you can either create a service account or use the built-in service accounts in order to make those services start, stop, or restart. There are 3 built-in service accounts, the local service, the network service, and the local system. The local system has privileges that are even more extensive than the administrative account, so you have to be really careful with the local system account. The advantage of using the built-in service account, no management is needed and password is managed automatically. So you never have to change passwords, you never have to manage those users. And by default, they're going to be used for a lot of different services. So even just installing the default Windows Server 2016, you go into the services program, you're going to see a whole bunch of different services that are already being managed by the local service or the network service. And here's exactly what I mean. So here's the services program, and you can see the log on as on the right-hand side. You can see local or network. Now, some programs are going to require the administrator for the log on service. And in that case, you'll see log on as administrator when that happens. So using an administrator-created service account, just like I was talking about. By using the administrator-created user account, you can assign only the rights and permissions the service needs to run correctly. So you got to keep several guidelines in mind. Assign only the rights and permissions the service needs. Use a complex password, very complex password. That means I would say at least 12 characters with upper and lower and various different characters. You want to set the password never expire and never use the account to log on interactively, and use one account per service. So to configure a logon account, open the Services MMC, double-click the service, and click on the Logon tab. There's lots of different ways to get to services. You can certainly type in MMC and then add services. You can also go to Server Manager, go to Tools, and go to Services, or just type in services.msc from a command prompt. Then you have to enter and confirm the password, and then Windows automatically assigns the logon as a service right. So that takes care of that. So here's what that looks like. When you log on, we go to the service, you double click on the properties, and you go to the logon tab. So you can see it's using an account and using a username and password. And when you apply that, it automatically gives that particular account the right to log on as a service. Service principal names. This is a name that uniquely identifies a service instance to a client. So each service must have a unique SPN, and the SPN is required for Kerberos authentication to take place. So an SPN consists of several different elements. You've got the service type, instance, port number, and service name. SPN is specified with the following syntax, so you can go ahead and take a look at that. Use that in PowerShell if you need to. And if you're using user accounts rather than managed service accounts, you might need to manage the SPNs, but mostly they're created, they're managed automatically. You'll hardly ever have to deal with an SPN. However, if you do, you have this set SPN exe command, which is really helpful when you have a service go down on you. Let's talk about managed service accounts. An MSA has several different attributes. System managed passwords, so you don't have to manage it. An automatic SPN created for you, tied to a specific computer, and can be assigned rights, permissions, used for interactive logon, and can't be locked out. So this is not a user account. This is a managed service account. So the requirement for using an MSA, it must be created in the Active Directory domain, and the computer where the MSA is used must be at least 2008, Windows 7 or newer. AD module for PowerShell must be installed, but that's you default on the servers, of course. You just have to add it for the workstations. And automatic SPN support, you must be using a domain functional level 2008 or newer, which of course we are. And so there's different MSA PowerShell commandlets as well. You don't really have to deal with MSAs very much as a junior administrator or SPNs, but when you have an advanced issue, you need to know what PowerShell commands to use to fix it. So that's why we talk about these. So working with these MSAs, they can only be used on a single server. If a service is running on multiple servers, you can use a group managed MSA, so a GMSA. And it's got to be 2012 or later. It's created in a similar way as MSAs, but you can specify which servers can use the account. So here's the PowerShell command to create an MSA, just in case you need to ever do that. And after it's created, you need to go to each server using the account and run this install AD service account commandlet. Virtual accounts, simplest service accounts to use. You don't need to create them, delete them, or manage them in any way. So sometimes they'll be called managed local accounts. So you need to configure the service to log on as NT / and then whatever service name it is. NT service and then service name with no password. Virtual accounts access the network with the credentials of the computer account where they're used. So this is what that looks like. So in this case, it's using the sysmain account, but it has NT service at the beginning, and you don't enter any kind of password. Now, it's not to be confused with anything to do with virtual servers, because these virtual accounts have been around for much longer than virtual machines have ever been. Kerberos Delegation, it's a feature of the Kerberos authentication protocol, and it allows a server to impersonate a client. And that relieves the client from having to authenticate to more than one service. So when would you use this? Well, if a client is authenticated to a service successfully, the service can then use that user's credentials to authenticate to another service on that client's behalf. So the delegation is available when you use a domain account as a service account, and the account has been assigned an SPN. Again, not something you have to deal with that often, but it's good to know what it is. Kerberos Delegation tab is added to the account properties and has three main options: do not trust, trust, and trust for specified services. I've only had to rarely have to go in and make changes to this kind of thing when a specific issue has come up, and Microsoft's TechNet article said you need to make changes to the delegation tab to get this to work properly. Otherwise, the default usually works just fine. So here's where that information is. You see the delegation tab in the advanced properties of the user, and you can go in and decide to go ahead and trust a service account for that particular usage. So we talked about user accounts having different options. We talked more in depth on group policy and what that all means. Password settings, service accounts, managed service accounts, all these things, very advanced stuff, not necessarily stuff you'll do on a regular basis, but you'll definitely need to know where those are for our quizzes and also for any Microsoft certification tests. So that does it for this module. Go ahead and get started on your lab, and we'll see you in the next one.